What's up, Frog Fanatics? Hope you're all having a fantastic afternoon. If you're here, that either means that you've been staying put through all of these deck guide videos that I've been doing recently, or you fell asleep and your computer's just been running. Either way, thank you so much for the continued support. As you know, we've been doing this deep dive series for a few days now to get players ready for RC Portland coming up this coming weekend. So I think this is going to be the last installment of this series. Hopefully we can get the video in, get it in people's hands before they're ready to register their deck list and begin the fight to hopefully take down that RC with their favorite version of Psychic Frog, Dimir Frog, Esper Frog, Grixis Frog, whatever you choose to register. And as I'm sure many of you have guessed, this video is the matchup guide for Dimir Oculus versus Black White or Orzhov Blink. Now, I will start off this video by saying that this has been the matchup guide that I've been the most terrified to put together. And it's not because I think that the matchup is just unwinnable or hopeless or anything like that, but it's the matchup that I have the least experience in by a mile. When I tell you I've tried to grind leagues to get some more experience in the matchup and just have not been running into Orzhov, dead serious. I've seen it a couple times. I've had mixed amounts of success. I'm going to share what I've learned, but I'm also going to be leaning a lot into the content of others that I've seen play on stream or on recordings and really utilize a lot of their patterns, what they've seen, what seemed to work for them, what hadn't worked, and discuss a lot of the findings from other people in my Discord, in the Metacord Discord, in a variety of other places that have had differing results in the matchup, and kind of share what the consensus has been and where you might be able to poke some holes in your opponent's game plan. So as always, we'll start off the video going over what to look for in the opponent's deck list in an open deck list event like Portland. We'll go over gameplay patterns in game one, mulligan decisions, play draw discrepancies. We'll go into sideboarding, card evaluations from both sides, game two and game three, play and draw considerations, and then finally leave you with some food for thought to hopefully give you some ideas that might be able to carry you across the finish line in the most victorious manner possible. So be right back, and we will go ahead and hop into some open deck list considerations. All right, so you've checked your phone, you've got your pairings, you see that your opponent is on a variation of Orzhov Blink. What should be going through your mind? What are you looking for? First and foremost, I'm seeing if I hit the matchup lottery. And by that, I mean I found one of these Orzhov players that is testing no copies of Aether Vial, because I 100% believe that not having Aether Vial swings the matchup from 2080 in Orzhov's favor to like 4060 in Orzhov's favor. It's a huge percentage boost to not have to worry about Aether Vial. It's an idea in some of these black-white discords and such that has been picking up a little bit of steam. I don't think it'll be popular enough of an idea before Portland comes around, but it's worth looking to see if that's the case, just in case. After the Aether Vial check and hopefully optimism that ensues, I'm looking at things like how many copies of Emperor of Bones, how many copies of Flicker Wisp, Skyclave Apparition. Most of the known quantity cards, pretty easy 4-ofs like the Solitudes, Overlords, Thelias, usually Ephemerate, probably Fatal Push, probably Aether Vial. But a lot of these tutor targets off Recruiter of the Guard, so your Haven Interrupters, your Skyclave Apparition, sometimes White Orchid Phantom, even Emperor of Bones, can potentially be one-ofs. And if they're one-ofs, then it does a lot of good to be able to recognize what lines your opponent may or may not actually have off of something like a late game Recruiter of the Guard. Say they've already gotten their Emperor of Bones, you've already gotten their Skyclave Apparition, you dealt with those. Now they're having to get like an extra Solitude to 2-for-1 themselves. Things that you can use to your advantage as the game goes on, and you see and recognize cards that are getting played out. Other than that, honestly, not much to take away from the Orzhov deck. You might, if you're on a list that's got like main deck Harbinger of the Seas, you might be able to find a line that cuts your opponent off black mana. So maybe they can't hard cast their Overlord or Fatal Push, Emperor of Bones. But it's not a huge likelihood that you're going to be able to do that and keep them off Aether Vial. But it is a possible thing to look for, just how many basics they have access to. So now that you've figured out what your opponent's list looks like, you sat down, shuffled up, you're ready to go. Let's talk about some mulligan decisions. Mulliganing on the play versus Orzhov. So on the play, you do have a good bit more flexibility than you would on the draw. Thoughtseize opens up is a very good card to have access to in your opening hand, letting you interact with Aether Vial and potentially catch your opponent like slipping on lands. You could look at taking away an early Solitude to be able to jam a threat. You can know what kind of threats you need to play around. Counter spell, spell snare, all a little bit better on the play when you can start looking at like jamming threats early, holding up mana after you've resolved something to hopefully fight over overlords or flicker wisps on an existing overlord, anything like that. It is important to note, if you're not running counterspell in the main or in your 75, you don't have a way of stopping a resolved overlord. And that is a fairly significant deal because that card will absolutely bury you in value, especially once they start getting to flickering it. If you have counterspell on the play, a hand that has counterspell active is a big deal because your opponent's not going to be able to vial in that overlord on turn 2. So they are going to have to hard cast it. Counterspell lines up well with that when you're talking just trading your 2 mana turn for their 2 mana overlord. So on the play, hand with counterspell, really nice. Like I said, Thoughtseize, Force Negation to interact with Aether Vial, really good. I don't mind seeing a hand with Force. I know after Aether Vial, they're pretty limited on their non-creature spells, but still being able to jam a frog and force a push or force an ephemerate on like a Solitude in the mid-game, both important lines to have access to. So don't think, oh, they're a creature-heavy deck. I got to throw back my force negations. Psychic Frog, really good in 99% of matchups in Modern. Orzhov might be the 1% that it's not. Obviously, like having a Psychic Frog on the battlefield and hitting your opponent is always going to be good. But when your opponent has got things like Fatal Push to kill the frog outright, Solitude to exile it so you can't unearth it, and then cards like Flicker Wisp and Felia that can blink the frog and reset all of its 1/1 counters, it means that your frog is going to be stuck doing 1 or 2 damage for a lot of the match, give your opponent a lot of extra draw steps, and that can be a pretty big liability. Oculus, your better threat by a mile, being able to not only get blinked without resetting you, but making extra bodies to make 1-for-1 interaction like Fatal Push, or in the case of Solitude, them 2-for-1ing you while you still get an extra body, kind of leans the advantage bar in your favor. But Graveyard Trespasser is, I would argue, best threat in the matchup by a fairly substantial margin. Being a target that your opponent can't flicker without triggering ward. If they go to Solitude at early, 3-for-1ing themselves off of Solitude to deal with the Trespasser. You get to start exiling creatures out of their graveyard to make Overlord a lot worse. It just provides a lot of value on an unearthable, easily hard castable threat. So if you do have an opening hand with the Graveyard Trespasser, a way to deal with the Vial, maybe another counter spell in there to help fight over an Overlord, then you've got a reasonable chance of putting up a good fight. On the draw, things definitely become a lot dicier. Game one, if you don't have a force negation and your opponent has an Aether Vial, the mana advantage that that's going to cause is going to create a pretty wide gap. So if you have an opening hand that's got like Spell Snare, Force Negation, or Spell Snare, Counterspell, maybe a couple cantrips and Oculus, I might consider throwing that back. Actually, I would highly consider throwing that back to look for a 6 that has a Force Negation just to try to slow the game down a bit. Obviously, there's a chance that your opponent doesn't have an Aether Vial in their opening hand, but they're going to know that you're a blue-black deck. They're going to have a higher propensity to keep a hand that does have an Aether Vial. And if things don't work out for you, you can always go to game 2 and 3. So don't feel like you have to try to play a slow roll value game 1. You always have more chances. Thankfully, that's the way this game works. Thoughtseize, still pretty good on the draw. You can hit an Overlord or like a Solitude or something. You're just not going to be able to deal with Aether Vial, so it's a big drawback, but it's still in the positive realm. We don't have a lot of interaction for anything that's going on, so Fatal Push is a pretty prime card to have access to. If you're running a list with some number of like Long Goodbyes, Shoot the Sheriff, Bitter Triumph, Cut Down, a lot of those extra removal spells get a lot of mileage in this matchup, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in the gameplay pattern section. From the Orzhov side, they're really going to be looking to keep hands that have an Aether Vial that they can get down under a counter spell. And then past that, Overlord of the Belmer, best card that they've got in the matchup. Some of their flicker effects, Felia, Flicker Wisp, Solitude, Skyclave Apparition, any combination of those cards is going to do a pretty good job of trying to put the clamps on us early. So from our side, just to reiterate on the play, looking for a Thoughtseize or Force Negation, Graveyard Trespasser, Oculus, Counterspell for Overlord, and hopefully a Fatal Push, couple lands. On the draw, looking more specifically for Force Negation, Thoughtseize is better than Counterspell because it can still interact with an Overlord, but Thoughtseize isn't going to be as good on the draw as it is on the play. Again, Graveyard Trespasser, Psychic Frog to help you try to pull ahead, some sort of threat on the draw just to get the pressure going. So let's get into some of the play patterns you're going to see in most of the games you're up against Blink. If you don't know a lot of the common interactions that the Blink deck presents, we'll go over those real quick so you have an idea of kind of combos of cards to look out for. So the predominant card advantage engine for the Blink deck is Overlord of the Balemerc, the 5/5 from Duskmourn with Impending for 1 and a black. So it enters as an enchantment. And when it enters, you mill 4 cards. Then you can return a non-avatar creature or planeswalker from the graveyard to your hand. All their creatures are non-avatars, so doesn't really matter there. But they get to return something they've already used, say a Solitude they've evoked, a Flicker Wisp they've blocked with. And every turn, that Impending takes down 5 to 4 to 3 to 2. As soon as it hits 0, the Overlord becomes a creature and can attack and get that same ETB trigger. The kind of combo here is Overlord can be flickered with cards like Felia, Exuberant Shepherd, which you've probably seen in Boros Energy before, or Flicker Wisp, which if you've played Modern for more than a year, I'm sure you've seen at some point or another. Either one can remove the Overlord from the game, and then return it to the battlefield later in the turn, and get another ETB effect, as well as remove all those impending counters. So the Overlord comes back as just a 5/5 that can start attacking the next turn. This is really useful in creating loops with effects like Flicker Wisp to bounce the Overlord, bring it back, get another card off it, block with the Flicker Wisp on something, go to their next turn, attack with the Overlord, get a trigger, get back the Flicker Wisp, cast the Flicker Wisp for like Vial the Flicker Wisp in again, bounce the Overlord again, get another card back from the yard, block with the Flicker Wisp again, and just repeat this, getting an extra card or an extra creature every single turn, plus having this infinite blocker with Flicker Wisp. Really great into board stalls, or if you're trying to hit your opponent with a frog or an Oculus, something like that. Just being able to extend the game out a really large amount without having to exert much effort. The other kind of interactions the deck has access to: Emperor of Bones, being able to exile something from the yard every turn, eventually adapt to reanimate a spell, maybe a Solitude or a Recruiter of the Guard, Flicker Whistling on their turn. Flicker Wisp and Felia can bounce the Emperor to reset it so they can adapt again and repeat the process. White Orchid Phantom and Felia, just repeatable Ghost Quarter effects until you're out of lands, and good luck at that point. Or you're out of non-basic lands. We've got Recruiter to help go find everything in the deck that's not Overlord of the Baelmerk. Witch Enchanter, we don't care about so much, but they can blink it to blow up artifacts and enchantments with Felia or Flicker Wisp. One of the fun interactions you see them do is playing Witch Enchanter face down as a land, Flicker Wisp to bounce it. It comes back in as Witch Enchanter, blows up an artifact or enchantment, and can be done as early as like turn 2. Or turn 3. What else? Not a ton of other interactions that we really care about. Just black, white, trade, binder, value town. From our side, some of the common interactions that we're really looking to set up in the first game, having access to, like I said, to Oculus, being a 2-for-1 by putting 2 bodies on the board that your opponent's got to interact with. Graveyard Trespasser, hopefully making your opponent discard if they do choose to target it. We've got Thoughtseize and Counterspell for Overlord of the Baelmerk, which, if you keep that card off the board, I do think the win percentage rises for you pretty rapidly. They've got a few key cards in the main. Overlord itself, Aether Vial, to a lesser extent, like Solitude or Felia. That if you're able to keep like these 3 cards off the board, Felia, Overlord, Aether Vial, your win percentage does increase very dramatically, very quickly. Obviously, I'm not going to go and say, oh, it's 70-30 in your favor if those stay off the board, but you have a very reasonable chance of winning any game that those don't stick around. So game 1, your primary game plan needs to be trying to find ways to interact with those things. So if you can't keep a hand that deals with Aether Vial, maybe you're on the draw, you don't have a Force Negation, I wouldn't throw back a hand that does have Thoughtseize and can interact with Overlord. Or if you're on the play and you can't fight over Vial, as long as you can counterspell the Overlord, you're taking a step in the right direction to get a win. Other play patterns to look for: Stern Scolding, if you're running any in the main, counters everything except Overlord. Really good for Solitude evokes. You definitely don't want your opponent to have access to like Evoke Solitude Ephemerate, so being able to counter the Solitude on the stack, really big deal. Graveyard Trespasser, exiling creatures before Baelmerk can get them back. And yeah, that's about it for game 1 and game 2. Let's jump into the sideboarding. So sideboarding on our side, on the Oculus side, I'm going to go over what I would sideboard with like a typical list, and then we're going to talk about a few extra options you might have access to, cards that some people have been trying out recently and having success with, some that have been kind of theory crafted. But either way, we'll get into those in a moment. With a traditional Dimir 75, or Dimir Oculus 75, and as always, I do want to really push towards Dimir first because these are cards that everybody will have access to. So even if you're running Sultai or you're running Esper, you'll have these cards available to you if you choose to run them. We will get into a few splash cards, but for the moment, Stern Scolding, best counterspell you can bring in. If you want to keep in some number of force negations, I would do so on the draw, but on the play, I would board all of them out because you've got access to Thoughtseize that can kind of do the same job while also hitting things if they don't have an Aether Vial. Consigned to memory. There's a few key interactions to know about when it comes to consigned to memory. Definitely better on the play because you can counter a turn 1 Aether Vial. But when it comes to hitting ETB abilities, some of them are going to be worth it if your opponent goes for a Solitude and they're empty-handed and you have the chance to consign to memory the Solitude ETB to like keep an Oculus around. If you think you can close the game out in a meaningful amount of time, probably worth it. But the more important interaction to know, it comes with Flicker Wisp and Thalia. When either of those creatures blink out a card, so for example, your opponent resolves an Overlord on turn 2, turn 3, they go to cast their Flicker Wisp, resolve it, target the Overlord leaves. There's 2 triggers that are created. And the first one is the Flicker Wisp entering the battlefield causes the ability to trigger to target something that you're going to blink out. So you target the Overlord. The Overlord leaves. At the end of the turn, another trigger is created to return the Overlord to the battlefield. You can consign that return trigger, and the Overlord just stays in exile forever. It can be useful if they go to try to bounce or flicker a Recruiter of the Guard, or like I said, an Overlord itself, maybe a Solitude, just to keep that thing away, don't have to deal with it anymore. A little bit more effective than trying to hit the ETB ability and that creature staying around on the battlefield and potentially getting blinked again later. Toxic Deluge, really great for wiping up a board stall, especially since most of their stuff is going to die, while Graveyard Trespasser, Oculus Frog, all very likely to live. Engineered Explosives, not the greatest. You can take out an Aether Vial, but you run the risk of your opponent having like a Flicker Wisp or a Thalia and just blinking your EE, comes back with 0 counters, and then you're not taking out anything. So bring that one in at your own risk. Nihil Spellbomb. If you want to bring in a Spellbomb or 2 to kind of help mitigate the graveyard against Overlord, you can. I don't think it's a very effective strategy because a lot of their cards are very redundant in the matchup, all either flickering something out or interacting with our board like Skyclave Apparition or Solitude. And so nuking all of their Skyclaves one time doesn't save you from the Solitudes off the top. And if they have an active Overlord going, they get to mill more cards and dig deeper anyway. So that one-time exile effect really not carrying its weight. Sideboarding out, I did mention force negation on the play being a lot worse because you do have access to Thoughtseize to kind of fill that same role. On the draw, it gets a little bit better, so you can fight over an Aether Vial on 1 and maybe Thoughtseize an Overlord. It's still not great. If it's on the end, or if it's getting towards the last few cuts and you've got thought or force negations in still, I would pretty heavily consider trimming them. Counterspell is good into Overlord because it's the only answer that we have to it. It's not a very efficient card in the matchup overall, especially when you look at like Aether Vials, you look at free spells like Solitudes. So Counterspell is usually getting a pretty good trim from me. Unearth depends on the graveyard hate your opponent's got access to. They're not really going to be running things like Rest in Peace with their own overlords, but Grafdigger's Cage is something that can show up, and that does stop Unearth as well as the Oculus from making tokens. So if Grafdigger's Cage is something that you see, you probably want to trim on some number of Unearth. But if you don't see Grafdigger's Cage or like Surgical Extraction, then you can leave more of the Unearths in. So to kind of sum up, Force Negation, Counterspell, Unearths are the things I'm most interested in trimming more aggressively. After that, trimming some number of cantrips is fine, especially like Thought Scour if you expect a lot of grave hate. Keep kind of that card filtering up with consider or preordain or whatever your secondary cantrip of choice is, Picklock, Prankster, or whatever. From the theoretical perspective, so some of these other cards down on the far right side. Turok is a card that's had a decent amount of success against Taxes lists in the past. It dodges Solitude, dodges Skyclave Apparition, Flicker Wisp, Felia Bounce. If your opponent's not on Bowmaster, it might have a little more use to you. I think the issue most people would have with Turok is this is kind of the only matchup that it would have any sort of usefulness. And for that reason, I think it's a little too narrow for me to want personally. If you're going Esper, Doorkeeper's Thrall is an option you might have access to. Maybe you're looking at Torpor Orb in one of the Dimir lists. Esper gives you an option to have an unearthable Torpor Orb in the form of Doorkeeper Thrall. Also has flash. You can flash in response to like a Flicker Wisp ETB or Flicker Wisp being cast or Vile activation or whatever, and stop a lot of the ETB nonsense. The downside for Doorkeeper's Thrall as compared to Torpor Orb is it is fatal pushable, and that is a pretty big deal when you're talking about your lockout piece, and it can be interacted with fairly easily. These Torpor Orb effects also don't stop things like Emperor Bones. They don't stop the attack trigger off Overlord of Baelmort, or they don't stop either trigger off Overlord, because when it enters, it's an enchantment, not a creature. They don't stop the attack trigger off Felia. Felia can also be used to blink them for the turn to allow them to resolve some spells. And then the Torpor will come back in end of turn, and they've already got their stuff on the battlefield. So I do think like the Torpor Orb effects are pretty good for slowing your opponent down. They're not an end-all be-all. And I know that's like the golden rule with most sideboarding options for Dimir is, hey, this card is really good at slowing your opponent down. It's not going to win you the game by itself. Torpor Orb and Thrall absolutely fall into that same category. Phyrexian Crusader, kind of like Turok, protection from white, allows you to attack in 5 turns. Hopefully the game's over. Does not attack through an Overlord very well. Doesn't attack through an Emperor Bones particularly well. And does not survive a Fatal Push. But if you're thinking of running Crusader against decks like Boros, then you might already have it in your sideboard. And if that's the case, you're bringing it in for this matchup. And then finally, Kaito. We already know my love of Kaito, so I'm not really one to have to take a lot of convincing when somebody says, oh, Kaito's doing well in a matchup. I've heard a non-zero number of people say that Kaito has been good for them in this matchup. And in theory, it makes sense because it does dodge like Solitude. It dodges Fatal Push. some of the instant speed removal, because on your turn it's a hexproof creature, on their turn it's a planeswalker. Any of the flicker effects just kind of bring it back as a planeswalker with 4 loyalty. So Felia attacks and Flicker Wisp itself aren't really doing a whole lot to it. You can stun down something like a Felia so they can't attack very effectively. It's, like I said, it's got stuff going for it. I don't know if I would say I'm super convinced on that line, but I also say that I have not tested it in the matchup yet. I intend to, and hopefully we'll have results sooner rather than later, but I have not tried it out yet. I just want to bring it up because I've had a non-zero number of people bring it up around me. Now, for the Orzhov side, what are they bringing in? Grafdigger's Cage definitely coming in because it stops Unearth. It stops Oculus. If you don't know this interaction with Oculus, it's kind of weird, but effectively, if you have an Oculus on the battlefield and your opponent has a Grafdigger's Cage, when you go to Manifest Dread on their turn, you've got these 2 cards that you're flipping over to try to put one face down as a creature. Grafdigger's Cage stops that creature from entering the battlefield because it entered from your graveyard, and it doesn't care if it's actually a creature card face down or not. It just sees a creature trying to enter the battlefield, the manifest from the library, and says, nope, you can't do that. So both of the cards end up going to the graveyard. Strange interaction, but it is what it is. March of Otherworldly Light and Wrath of the Skies really often are coming in. They're answers to Torpor Orb and effects like that, but also good is just additional answers to Oculus or Frog, some of these like snowballing effects that we've got. Of note, they do not answer Phyrexian Crusader. Well, I guess Wrath does if you have enough energy, but Phyrexian Crusader and Turok, both pretty safe from those. Thoughtseize could potentially come in. That's kind of it. White Orchid Phantom's pretty mid. Surgical, I think, can save more for the combo matchups than us. Things that they're likely to be boarding out on. White Orchid Phantom, again, pretty mid in the matchup. We don't need a large number of lands to cast everything. We have enough basics to cover it. Not the most impactful. Aven Interrupter, kind of mid as well. Witch Enchanter, if they want to keep the land count up, is fine. If they don't want to keep the land count up, probably end up trimming there. And then like Ephemerate's okay. But when you're up against a removal heavy deck, Ephemerate can very much be a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's going to be great for countering a removal spell. Sometimes it's going to be terrible because the removal spell counters your Ephemerate. Some number of hedging going on there. So that's it for sideboarding. Let's get into some post-board game plans. All right, we already talked a good bit about post-board gaming during the sideboarding segment, but I just wanted to make sure we had an idea for like our mulligan decisions. If you're on the play post-board, cards like Consign to Memory have a lot of value for being able to answer an Aether Vial, as well as that whole trick I mentioned about exiling a creature before it comes back from a flicker effect. That does not work for Ephemerate, but you can Consign to Memory the rebound trigger on an Ephemerate. So say you got 2 creatures out, they Solitude 1, Ephemerate their Solitude. You want to play out another threat, you can consign that rebound trigger. Thought these really high priority post board. Again, Graveyard Trespasser. Really, the idea for being on the play post board is having an answer to the Aether Vial if they've got it, and having an answer to the Overlord, just like in game 1, but then trying to not overcommit as much as you can. So you want to get pressure out. You don't want to play everything at once because you run the risk of something like Wrath of the Skies or Solitude plus March, just kind of wrathing your board. You want to treat it a lot like a control matchup where you're putting enough pressure that they have to respect it, but you're not overloading to the point of just getting blown out by an Ephemerated Solitude. As far as the sideboard cards go, Toxic Deluge is just kind of waiting to see if you get into a board stall or you fall behind and you need a pick-me-up there. I wouldn't really recommend deluging just for like 2-for-1 value into a, I don't know, Boggart, Trawler, Felia or something. I would try to lean more on the removal spells for that. From the Orzhov side, their game plan is pretty much the same. Just going for flicker value effects. If they do think that you're running Torpor Orb, Doorkeeper Thrall, something like that, then definitely expect the Marches and the Wrath of the Skies. If they don't expect you to be running those, there's a chance they're not boarding it in and they're just sticking predominantly to their game one plan. So it kind of becomes up to us to disrupt that blink plan as much as possible with our consigns or thought seizes. Priority establishment, I'd usually say Overlord is the most problematic card in the matchup. So if you have the chance to exile an Overlord with a consign while it's being flickered, that's usually highest tier priority that you can get to. Thought seizing it is nice, but you do run the risk of something like Emperor of Bones, exiling it and getting it back, getting more triggers, and that can really get out of hand really quickly. Note that Emperor of Bones is usually going to get saved for a turn where they're able to exile something impactful and like immediately get it back if they can afford to save it. So you're usually not going to see Emperor just get run out on turn 2. Turn 2 and 3 is pretty well reserved for Felia and Overlord and not falling behind on board. So like Evoking Solitude, Ephemerating Solitude, whatever the case may be there. I have noticed, and this is where we get a lot more into watching other players play the matchup. I've seen players like Figanti play it. I've seen Young Dingo play the Orzhov side against Dimir several times. I've seen a couple players in the Discord streaming it. And some of the things that I would like to take away are the more removal spells you've got, the more instant speed removal spells you've got in your 75. I think that sways the matchup pretty heavily. You can see that reflected in matchups like the Boros deck, where they just have more spot removal than we do, and that is able to help them outvalue a lot more. Not only do they have the discharges and the discharges and the static prisons, but flages and goblin bombardments, being able to pick stuff off, really, really important for their game plan. When we have access to additional cards like Cut Down or Long Goodbye, Shoot the Sheriff, it does seem to make it a little more comfortable to be able to fight over cards like Ephemerate or to keep Bale Merc off the board if it becomes a creature. I don't know if I mentioned it in game 1 in that breakdown, but you can't force negation in Overlord. It is a enchantment creature on the stack, and then an enchantment once it actually resolves. So force negation can't hit it because it's a non-creature, or because it is a creature. Spell Snare can't hit it because its actual CMC is 5, even if they're impending for 2. Burn Scolding can't hit it because it's a big creature, but stuff like that. The red versions, Grixis, has some pretty cool tools. Unholy Heat, again, is just additional spot removal, helps out a lot. Cards like Meltdown are nice for taking out Aether Vials, though I wouldn't say they're great against the rest of the deck. The Esper variations, Prismatic Ending is a really good card to have access to. Hits Vile, hits pretty much any of the creatures except for Overlord and Solitude. You could run Path to Exile if you want a little extra exile-based removal for the matchup, giving them an extra basic when they've got Aether Vials. Doesn't really impact things too terribly much. Sultai has got access to, like, pick your poison that can target enchantment or artifact to get a Vial or an Overlord off the board. Abrupt Decay is like a long goodbye stand-in is nice. Not really a lot in terms of green creatures to try out. I looked around all over Scryfall for creatures with hexproof or decent ETB abilities, protection from white or black. Not a long list of things that you can do to really sway the matchup there. So I think a lot of it is just going to come down to clean play. Any other ideas that I've seen people mess around with? Dolphy Voidwalker is a card that's like really good into Breach, has some overlap into Orzhov just being an additional threat, as well as kind of shutting off Overlord from getting triggers. Because the way Overlord is worded, you mill the 4 cards, and then you get to pick a card for your graveyard. So if they get milled over into a Dolphy, they don't go to the graveyard, so they don't get to pick a card with Overlord. If it said something like mill 4 and then put one from among them into your hand, you would through a Dolphy. So nice little shutdown interaction that Dolphy's got there, as well as, like I said, just being an additional body in a matchup that really wants you to have additional bodies. If you're on Murktide, it has the same kind of issue as Psychic Frog, as the Flicker Wisps and the Felias can blink it, reset all the counters on it, bring it back as just 3/3. In which case, it's not attacking into too terribly much. Still okay as a 3/3 flyer, but not quite as good as a 7/7 or an 8/8 flyer that dodges push. The other cards, Dreams of Steel and Oil, people have talked about in a positive light. It allows you to hit a threat out of the hand, and if they have like a Solitude in the yard, Flicker Wisp, whatever, you can potentially exile that one as well. So if you're looking for a Thoughtseize replacement explicitly for black-white, then Dreams of Steel and Oil could be right up your alley. What else? Talked about Esper. Talked about Grixis, Sultai, the Dimir options. I feel like there's probably a card that I'm forgetting, but if I end up remembering it, I'll put it down in the comments. But for the most part, that's all I really got about the Orzhov matchup. I wish I could give a lot more detailed information on things that have been working for me. But like I said, I've just not been seeing the matchup as much as I would like to. But I will have a more extensive testing video going into RC Charlotte in a month. So if you are curious about how things progress, there will be updates on that. Otherwise, as always, links down below in the socials. If you want to come talk on Discord, check out the Twitter, check out the Twitch, anything like that. Links all the way down below for those. We'll have a link in the description to my current 75, so the 75 that I would register right this second if I were playing in RC Portland. I'll have timestamps for the important moments on the video. And yeah, that's about it. So hopefully you enjoyed what information I could gather together to share with you. Hopefully it helps you swing the matchup in your favor. As always, hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.